the day, we've got a new piece of research that is going to be presented by Rohan Gifford from Google. Rohan's a long-term friend of the IAB, has been for his joy and sins part of the Measurement Council historically through Google and previous companies, so knows us well. As we talked about earlier, attention has been a hot topic in market over the last few years, and we're starting to see more and more experiments, models, reviews at what this means for marketers and how we can not only, I guess, from an environmental point of view, make sure that we're doing the right thing for consumers and brands, but also from a creative point of view, that we've got ways of really garnering attention. We heard in the session with Angelina and Paul and Imran the importance of creative and making sure that branding message is going quite, is up front and centre. So Google have done some work locally, I think, building off some of the work that they've done globally on video content and video ads. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Rohan and he's going to take you through this research. Please remember, pop Q&A in the box. I'll try and get to any that we haven't got to so far at the end of the session as well. But Rohan's open for questions. Over to you, Rohan.
Thanks very much, Gai. I will just start presenting and then kick off. Can you see my screen now okay?
Yep, all good.
Great, fantastic. So it was actually interesting when Matt was giving his introduction at the start of the day, he talked about some work he'd been doing in 2017 and 2018. And as Gai just mentioned, I've had some involvement with the IAB for a fair while. In fact, when I was preparing for the session today, I was thinking about the first involvement I ever did have with the IAB, which I believe was a Measurement Council meeting I attended in the middle of 2008, so more than 12 years ago. And one thing I remember from back then was the biggest issue we were dealing with at that time was if we were able to accurately measure internet activity on people's computers at work. So the idea of this deduplicated cross-screen measurement seemed like something a very long way off. And I'm pretty sure back then I'd never even heard of smart TVs, and I would expect many other people were in that boat. And we've heard a lot already about measurement today. When I got back to Australia at the end of last year, following about 6 years in the UK, I was really struck by the progress which the IAB and Nielsen had made, both in terms of what we can measure and also several dimensions of the granularity with which we can measure it. And we just heard Gai and Matt discussing that topic in the last session. But as necessary as these measures of reach and exposure are, and will always continue to be, one of the outcomes of the proliferation of platforms, devices, and environments on and in which we consume media is that I would argue these measures are no longer sufficient for either the planning or measurement of advertising campaigns if we want those campaigns to be as effective as possible. We need to complement our measurement of exposure with a better understanding of attention. Now, I suspect that's not new news to any of you. As Gai just mentioned, attention is a topic which is gaining increasing focus both here and in other countries. So we, as Google, want to contribute to the industry's understanding of attention, how it should be measured, why it varies and why it matters. And in fact, our first piece of attention research in Australia dates back to 2015, but obviously we're not alone in this space. So lots of other publishers, agencies, and groups like the Attention Council are really active in the attention space. Now, unquestionably, attention is difficult to measure, and I think you could even argue that it's difficult to define. But what I have to share with you today is some really interesting, groundbreaking research that we undertook in Australia earlier this year, together with Kantar and iSquare, to uncover some new insights into both how and why audiences pay attention to some ads and not to others. But I'm also particularly happy that I'm doing this at MeasureUp, because the dual focus we have here over the next couple of days of marketing outcomes and the science of measurement means that as well as sharing the outcomes of this research with you, I can do two other things. First, I can geek out a little bit about the methodology of our research, and certainly any of you who know me will know that that methodological geeking out is something I do tend to gravitate towards. But I'm also able to take some of the key things we observed in our research with Kantar and see if our database of the thousands and thousands of YouTube brand lift studies we've run over the last few years either show these insights holding at even greater scale or provide additional complementary learnings to what we learned in our research with Kantar. So to kick off with the methodology of our study with Kantar and I-Square, what did we do and why did we do it? Well, we recruited a group of Australian adults who agreed to let us observe their media consumption via eye tracking glasses. And you might be thinking, well, eye tracking research in itself isn't particularly groundbreaking, but what made this research different was the eye tracking glasses that we used. So these glasses are I-Square's latest and most innovative technology, and this is the first time that they've been used in Australia. And in fact, if you've been wondering what the significance of the picture on the left-hand side of the slide that I have up now is, it's actually someone wearing these eye tracking glasses. And you would be certainly excused for not having noticed that, just because of how much like normal glasses they look. No mess of cables connected to a laptop or TV, just an app on the phone. So these eye tracking glasses work like you would expect. This is just a short clip of some actual footage from the research. And if you can see the circle on the screen, that indicates where the respondents' eyes were focused. But it's really the unobtrusive design and usage of these glasses which is their greatest strength. So as well as our respondents using the glasses in their own home, like we saw here, they could also use them when they were out and about. And that's shown by this short clip, which actually has one of our respondents using the glasses on the bus. Our respondents could consume or not consume whatever media they wanted. And so it's really these factors which combined to allow us to observe attention in the most natural way possible. And I really think is it's this fact, this naturalness and the minimisation of artificiality of both environment and also content, which are the most compelling aspects of this research. So in our field work, we were able to measure the attention paid to over 2,800 ads across YouTube, free-to-air and catch-up TV. And then all of our respondents completed a quantitative survey and a subset participated in a qualitative phase to allow us to dig deeper into some of the behaviours that we'd seen. But as I mentioned, what I also want to do today is lay these results next to the results we've seen from thousands of brand lift studies we've run globally over the last few years. And when I say brand lift in this context, what I'm referring to is the brand lift product, which is built into YouTube's ad serving infrastructure. Many of you may have some familiarity with the details of our brand lift offering, but just in case any of you don't, I think just a small final amount of methodological geeking out is warranted here. So when we're measuring the brand lift of an ad which is participating in the auction on YouTube, we randomly hold back a sample of people, but they only go into our control group at the point in time when the ad under measurement wins the auction for their ad impression. The advertiser obviously doesn't pay for this impression because it's not actually shown. But what we do have now is a very robustly selected control group, which differs only from our exposed arm because they didn't see the ad. And so then between a few hours and a few days following either exposure or being held back, we survey people when they're back on YouTube, which means we've then run a really properly randomly controlled trial and can draw causal conclusions about advertising effectiveness. Now, this measurement also benefits tremendously from YouTube's scale. We collect thousands of responses for each survey and run thousands of these surveys every year. So we do have a very rich data source of brand lift for further analysis. And so with that, with this combination of the cutting edge research we ran here in Australia with Kantar and I-Square and our database of brand lift results, there are 4 key learnings that I want to share with you today. I'll look at the actual measurement of attention in our study, what it was and how it varied, and then 3 of the drivers of attention we've uncovered in terms of choice, creative, and context. So look, I realise that at this point I've talked about attention and I've talked about eye tracking, but I haven't linked the two. so I will do that now. In this project with Cantor and I-Square, our primary outcome metric, or our measure of attention, was the percentage of ad duration with eyes on screen. And this is a metric that's been supported by other work that we've done internationally with Media Sciences and the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which showed that viewed time was by far the most important attention variable for predicting ad impact. And I do expect that when we hear from Playground XYZ tomorrow about their research, that they would agree with this point. And it's also certainly supported by our brand lift data. And so here is the first time where I'll introduce some of those results. So this slide shows the outcome of some analysis we did, where we took the results of about 1,000 brand lift studies and separated out the individual responses for those studies and looked to see if the ad shown for those responses was audible and or viewable. And so this is what we found. Across ad recall, brand awareness and consideration, we see significantly stronger brand response when people are exposed to ads that are audible and viewable compared to when this isn't the case. So just to explain what these numbers mean, in the case of ad recall, the difference between our exposed and our control group was 2.7 times higher for people exposed to ads that were audible and viewable compared to people exposed to ads that were audible only. Now, obviously, an ad being viewable does not guarantee that it will be viewed, as I will go on to show you very shortly. But this strong relationship between viewability and effectiveness does clearly support the use of eyes on screen as our attention message in this research. And so look back to the research here in Australia. Across the 2,800 odd ads that we measured on YouTube, free-to-air and catch-up TV, we saw that 51% of viewable ad minutes had eyes on screen. And this is a very similar figure to some recent walk research, which also had a figure in the low 50s. But this is the point where, if I was presenting in a live forum, I think I'd probably ask for some audience interaction to see if folks actually expected this number would have been higher or would have been lower. And if I had been able to do that, I expect most of you would probably have expected a lower number, as my scrolling ahead a bit too quickly before just revealed that this 51% was actually 2 times higher than what the people in our respondents, the amount of attention that they thought they had paid to ads. Now, one important dimension where we did see variation in this key metric was by platform. So across the ads that we measured, YouTube had eyes on screen for 64% of ad minutes, which made it the platform with the highest percentage of eyes on screen, followed by catch-up TV on 54% and free-to-air TV on 49%. And so the obvious next question is, why do we see these results? What was the difference in the experience that our respondents had on the platforms that led to this difference in behaviour? And that's what the bulk of the rest of my presentation is about, because obviously there are a number of reasons that people will pay attention to some ads and not to others. Now, some of the reasons I'll go into talk about are platform agnostic. A bad ad can be a bad ad, whether it's shown on YouTube or TV. But our research did suggest some reasons which may be more fundamental to the platform. So firstly, from the eye tracking in our research, we saw that eyes on screen dropped by 13% from the first ad to the second ad in multi-ad breaks on TV. And in both the quantitative and qualitative phase of the research, people told us they roughly know when and how long ad breaks will be on free-to-air TV and may actually plan for other activities during this time. So in some sense, we may have trained people how to not pay attention to some ads because of their predictability. But one particularly interesting thing we were able to do in our research was observe people taking mobile devices with them as they moved around. So one of the advantages of the eye tracking technology again. And obviously that ability to pick up a device and take it with you makes it easier to maintain eyes on screen for either YouTube or catch-up TV. And so this could be another factor contributing to the results that we saw at the platform level. Now, as I've said, I'll dig into a range of the other reasons people pay attention to some ads and not others. But before we leave the measurement space, there are just a few more insights to share about the relationship between eyes on screen and effectiveness that I think it is important for us to talk about. So firstly, in our research here in Australia, there was a significant correlation between the share of attention paid, or eyes on screen, and unaided ad recall. And again, we also saw that in the media sciences and Ehrenberg-Bass research that I mentioned previously. And interestingly, in that research, we did see examples of unfamiliar brands needing 10 times as much viewed time as familiar brands to have the same ad recall impact, which I think is very interesting and also worth bearing in mind, both when we're planning campaigns, but also when interpreting the results of any research on specific ads, if they can be quite sensitive to this brand familiarity. Now, obviously, one of the ways that view time or attention in our research can be increased is by people watching more of a single ad. And another way for that to happen is for people to watch multiple ads in a campaign. So to complement this view time correlation from our eye tracking research, I wanted to show you these results from our brand lift analysis, which are the relationship between frequency and ad effectiveness. So this chart shows shows brand lift for different metrics at different frequency levels, and for each of these metrics, the lift is indexed to the lift at frequency 1 for that metric. But there are 3 things that I find particularly interesting about this chart that I'd like you to take away. So the first of which is right across the funnel from ad recall through to purchase intent, we have significant lift amongst people exposed just the once. So here we have absolute proof that advertising, and YouTube advertising in particular here, drives lift in brand metrics from the first impression. Second, and again for all metrics, we have higher lift amongst people exposed twice than people exposed once, and higher again amongst people exposed 3 to 5 times. And in fact, for all of our metrics, except for favourability, which perhaps somewhat ironically is the least popular brand lift question to ask, and so the metric that we actually have the least data for, we have evidence of significantly higher lift again amongst people exposed 6 or more times. And so then the third and final thing to take away from this analysis is that in general, though, we do get the highest lift per impression amongst people exposed just the once. So that would imply this is the area where you are getting the biggest bang for your buck. So hopefully now we're all comfortable that eyes on screen are important, and I will move on to talk about 3 of the primary drivers of attention we've seen, which are choice, creative, and context, starting firstly with choice. So look, I think at a general level, I don't think anyone would disagree that people will pay more attention to content that they've chosen. And one quantification of that result is from some research that we did in the UK, where viewers told us that they're 40% more likely to mostly or entirely pay attention to a video that they've actively selected versus one that they're passively consuming. And this finding certainly extends to advertising as well. There are different extents to which it's possible to choose to watch or not watch ads on different platforms. The skip button on YouTube ads is perhaps the most straightforward way to exercise this choice. And we certainly believe this choice is good for advertisers because they don't pay for impressions which are skipped, but it's also good for viewers. And I think that was supported by our research here in Australia, where we actually saw it was the ads which a user could have skipped but didn't that had the highest attention. The next driver of attention to talk about is creative. And look, it's certainly an important one, but it is a driver that I need to be very careful about because I am definitely a numbers guy and not a creative guy. But luckily, all is not lost because we do still have some quite interesting numbers about creative. So we've already heard from Paul on the discussion panel earlier today, and some of the analysis that he and the folks at Analytic Partners did showed that copy, quality, or creative were responsible for a majority of an ad's ROI on both TV and online. And some other work that Analytic Partners did has also seen a 48% improvement in sales from digital video when people were making bespoke creative for that platform. Some of the other interesting results about creative come from the folks at Google who are much more creative than me. And they've done a lot of work to analyse advertising performance and see if they can find correlations between creative elements of ads and the advertising performance. Now, there's obviously no recipe for a perfect creative or any way to guarantee the success of a particular creative, But we have found that there are creative elements that are correlated with advertising success. And two of the ideas that come out of that work are either to go short or get chosen. And so for the latter of these in particular, we did see that our ads in our research here in Australia, which had the highest percentage of eyes on screen, employed creative elements that are consistent with our global learnings. So, for example, one of the things that we've found can be more successful in a world of choice, so even if viewers don't have a skip button for every ad, they do have alternative ways to choose to not watch an ad, picking up another device or talking to a pet or something like that. But we have found that in these conditions, an ad that grabs and holds attention with a story arc like the one on the right of this slide can be more successful than the more traditional story arc on the left. And in the panel discussion earlier, I noticed Angelina made a great point about the placement of branding within an ad and its relationship to advertising effectiveness, which is certainly something that we've seen from our internal analysis as well. But I do think that even that, probably that sort of treatment of creative is about as much as it's sort of wise for me to talk about. So I might go back to spreadsheets and numbers now and get back to the drivers of attention and the third of these, which is context. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say here that I've left the best of the drivers to last, but I might argue that I've left the most interesting simply because of how many dimensions context can have and some of the things that we have seen in this area. So as I said, context can mean a lot of things. It could be the time of day or the day of week people are exposed to an ad. It could be if they're watching an ad alone or with other people, or it could be where they are. And this was one of the really fascinating things we saw in our eye tracking research here in Australia. So I mentioned before that the design and the use of I-Squares glasses meant we could measure attention both in and out of the home. And some of our respondents actually wore the glasses on their commutes to work. This is back in the day when people used to commute to work. And we saw some of that in the short video that I showed earlier. And so in that, when people were sharing their experiences with us and they were out of home, we did see some examples of people consuming media when they were walking along the street. It's a behaviour that I'm certainly guilty of. It's not necessarily one that I would condone, but that's not a particularly stable environment. However, we did see people in what we would call stable out-of-home settings, like sitting on a bus. And in these stable out-of-home settings, we saw that ads could achieve the same level of eyes on screen as they did in in-home environments. Now, that may or may not be expected, but when you think about it, these settings typically include headphones to reduce or even remove all other distractions. And so these stable, typically smartphone out-of-home experiences are another example of one of the key things we observed in our research, which is that screen size is not one of the major drivers of attention. So another very important aspect of context for advertising is the content next to which the advertising is delivered. Or in other words, do car ads do better when they're shown before car content? And these results from our global brand lift analysis show that they do. So on this chart, the dark blue bars are the brand lift from ads which were shown before contextually matched content. And the light blue bars are the brand lift from ads that were shown before content that was not contextually matched. And as well as car ads, which are the first example on the left of this slide, we have a number of other examples of contextually matched ads outperforming non-contextually matched ads. So then the next dimension of context I want to consider is personal value. So how much do I care about or how engaged am I in the content I'm consuming when I'm shown an ad around that content? A data point from some research that we did in the UK here shows that this is the case with people exhibiting 4 times as many engagement and investment signals when they were watching content that had high personal value to them. And here these engagement and investment signals were things like changing the volume, pausing, rewinding, changing your phone from portrait to landscape, these kind of things. But this is another result that we certainly have seen in our brand lift data. So to look at this concept on YouTube, we've used the concept of a channel's preference score. And just to briefly explain what that is, Many of you may be aware of YouTube Select, which is inventory that runs before some of the most popular and engaging channels on YouTube. And we identify that content by giving every channel a preference score based on a whole range of signals like watch time, repeat viewership, and then social interactions, likes and shares, and so on. And what we did here was take the results from about 5,000 brand lift studies, and we broke them down by the preference score of the video following the ad being measured. So not the preference score of the ad, but the preference score of the video people were watching after the ad. And this chart shows the results for ad recall. So we have preference score on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis is ad recall lift. And we see here that the higher the preference score, the higher the brand lift. Or in other words, what we found is that ads work better when they're shown before more popular and engaging content. I've only shown the results for ad recall here, but we did certainly find this result consistent for other metrics and across various countries and devices also. And so then the final of my dimensions of context, which I wanted to look at, is not related to ad effectiveness in the context of the content in which it's served, but the context of the audience to whom it's served. And so is it served to people who are in market for the product which is being advertised, or have at least displayed an interest in that product? So to investigate this point, what we really wanted to be able to do was isolate the impact of targeting on advertising effectiveness, and so control for other things, other confounding factors like creative that I've already talked about. So what we did here is found examples where the same ad had been served in two different circumstances. Once just using intent signals on YouTube, and then secondly, just using demographic signals. And so when we compared the performance under these situations, this is what we found. So ads served with intent signals only had a consideration lift 30% higher and purchase intent lift 40% higher than when the same ads were served using demographic signals alone. And so, look, leaving on that point, that does sort of wrap up the sort of the content that I had to share with you today. I mean, I certainly hope from the last sort of 25 minutes or so, you would agree with me that I think this was a pretty fascinating piece of research that we did here in Australia, and where we were able to use eyes on screen to measure attention using this really innovative technology from iSquare and partnering together with Kantar. And in that, we could then observe some of the key drivers of attention that we saw in the way that our respondents behaved around choice, around creative, and around context. And that a lot of those have been supported by learnings from either other research that we've done internationally or our internal brand lift studies. Now, obviously, the focus of what I've been talking about so far today has been advertising. We are very interested, though, also in the attention that people pay to content more generally. And that will be the next phase of this particular piece of research. But if you would like to learn anything more about the stuff I've been discussing today, I think probably a really great place to start is at this link, g.co/YouTube Unboxed Connect. And yeah, so obviously do, or let me know if you have any additional questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rohan. That was amazing. I almost wanted to ask questions every slide, but I knew I wouldn't be allowed. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but first there's a question from the audience, and it's around, I guess, around frequency. And you showed some of the change in metrics going to sort of 6+. Mm-hmm. There's always that talk of diminishing returns after a certain amount. Do we know that sweet spot yet?
So I don't know that from YouTube data, and one of the main reasons for that is because one of the things that advertisers can and very often do on YouTube is actually frequency cap. So people will set frequency caps at a weekly, monthly campaign level. And it does mean that once we go past the frequency levels that I showed on the slide of 6+ and so on, the data does actually get, despite our millions of brand lift responses, the data does get quite sparse. And so I'm certainly not going to come out here and say that there is a significant positive relationship beyond that point, but I, in my analysis, haven't been able to identify where diminishing returns kick in. Now, obviously, we'd expect where they do to also vary at different points in the funnel. I mean, I think if I keep showing someone an ad, I don't think they're less likely to remember it, but I can probably piss someone off and actually lower consideration or favourability at various points. Look, I think it's a fair question and one I'd love to be able to answer, but
Yeah.
not one I've been able to using the data that we have.
It's also a tricky one, though. I guess creatives getting a little bit more varied, pulling together from different platforms and different outlets, understanding that frequency across all channels.
That's a very good point. And I mean, and it is also worth pointing out that in general, when I do that sort of analysis using our brand lift data, I'm doing that at the campaign level, which can certainly include campaigns with a wide range of creative. So that isn't necessarily someone seeing the same ad twice. It could be people seeing two different ads in the same same campaign. Sorry.
One question I had for you, and you'll probably think it's an odd one, but we've been doing a lot of work with our audio group, and I know YouTube's looking a lot at sort of audio ads, and you had the impact of audio alone, video alone, and then combined. Do you think, and this is for your next research piece, I think, if people are expecting it to be an audio ad, that differs? So if they're in an environment where, they're listening to music, is that impact different than if they're just listening into a video piece while they're doing something else?
So yeah, look, I mean, okay, so firstly, I absolutely don't know the answer to that, but it is a fascinating question. But it's almost asking about people's expectations of the creative in some sense. Like, do I expect this creative to have something that moves, or do I expect it to just have sound?
It's almost like expecting the subtitles now, if you're particularly in a social channel.
I mean, that's pretty fascinating. I mean, I think that feels like a question that just feels like a question that is so right for some good experiments. I mean, one of the other things that we do, and I didn't talk about it in any detail today, but we do have some really nice ability to run experiments within YouTube campaigns as well, where we can very, very neatly just like get segments of cookies and make sure there's no contamination, some of these sorts of things. And so, look, I think, like that, as you said, a great idea for some future research, but I don't know the answer to now.
I'll leave that with you. Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions coming out. So everyone who's on the call, we will share the video of this next week, so you can share with your friends and family. And thank you so much for joining us, Rohan. And thank you for geeking out. That's exactly what we want.
Always love geeking out, Katie.
Perfect. Thank you.
Bye now.
All right. So that's our last